The golden light of dawn spread slowly across the rolling hills of Virginia, painting the landscape in soft hues of amber and gold. From her bedroom window, Margaret Graham stood motionless, her hands gripping the windowsill as though it could anchor her to the world she was about to lose. The view before her, the wide fields, the forests in the distance, the towers of the Graham estate glowing in the rising sun, should have offered comfort. Yet to her, it was a farewell. The land she had known since birth, the halls that carried her footsteps since childhood, no longer felt like hers. Today, her father would see to that. His words from the night before rang in her ears as sharp and fresh as when they had been spoken. "A daughter like you is a disgrace to this family," William Graham had said, his voice rising with fury. His once handsome face, now hardened by age and pride, had turned crimson with anger. "For years, I have tried to marry you off, and not a single man of standing would take you. Too heavy, too stubborn, too unfeminine." Margaret had heard such words all her life, yet this time they had struck deeper. She had endured them in silence as long as she could remember, shrinking beneath the shadow of her younger sister, Sophia. Sophia was everything their father prized: slender, graceful, obedient. She bore their late mother's delicate features, a vision of elegance. Margaret, by contrast, carried the sturdy frame of her grandmother, a woman once admired for her strength until society began worshipping fragility. "You will be sent to Ironwood," her father had continued, with a tone as final as a judge's gavel. "I have arranged for you to live with the blacksmith, Frederick Ellison. He needs a wife, and you need a man who will work you into shape. Perhaps then you will finally shed those disgraceful pounds." The humiliation had burned more deeply than any whip. She had never expected affection from her father, but to be given away like livestock, to be cast off without even the dignity of a dowry, worse, with money offered to persuade the man to take her, was unbearable. A Graham daughter handed to a tradesman. It was unthinkable, yet her father had thought of everything. To society, the story would be that Margaret had chosen the path of piety, retreating into a convent. No one beyond the estate walls would know the truth. The sound of footsteps outside her chamber pulled her from her thoughts. The maid entered with lowered eyes, carrying the plain gray travel dress her father had decreed she wear. Margaret forced herself to stand tall. She would not give them the satisfaction of tears. By mid-morning, she found herself seated in the carriage. her small bundle of belongings at her feet. The horses jerked forward, hooves crunching over the gravel path. The estate loomed behind her, but she refused to turn her head. William Graham had not appeared to see her off. Only old Bertram Harris, the faithful house steward, had pressed something into her hand in secret. A worn leather-bound book and a pouch of dried herbs. "You'll need this, Miss Margaret," he had whispered, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "And remember, your worth lies not in your name, nor in your form, but in what you carry here." He touched his chest with a trembling hand. The carriage rattled on for hours. Each jolt carried her further from her past, further from the world she had known. When the driver finally shouted that they had reached Ironwood, Margaret leaned forward to look. The village was little more than a handful of wooden houses stretched along a dusty road. Roofs sagged beneath the weight of age, and smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. Fields lay barren beyond, and dense woods pressed close. The place looked rough, unwelcoming, and yet it would be her new home. The carriage came to a halt in the square. A crowd had gathered, curious eyes fixed on the stranger who stepped down. Margaret's heart hammered as she placed her feet on the packed dirt. Whispers erupted at once. "That's her? The Graham girl? No wonder her father sent her away." She heard laughter, saw hands covering mouths to stifle sneers. A woman balancing a basket of turnips snickered openly. An old man muttered, "Ellison's got himself a burden, not a wife." Margaret lifted her chin, though her cheeks burned. She would not bow her head, not now. The driver tossed her small bundle into the dirt and handed a sealed letter to a man who had stepped forward. "Frederick Ellison?" the driver asked. "Yes," the man answered. Margaret's eyes moved over him. He was tall, broader than most of the men gathered, his arms thick with muscle. A leather apron hung across his chest, his shirt stained with soot. His skin bore the sun's mark, his eyes steady beneath dark brows. His hands, rough and scarred, spoke of years at the forge. He read the letter with no flicker of emotion, then folded it neatly and slid it into his pocket. When his gaze rose to hers, Margaret braced for mockery. Instead, he inclined his head slightly. "Miss Graham," he said in a calm voice that surprised her, "welcome to Ironwood." He bent, picked up her bundle, and held it out to her. "Come," he said simply, turning to walk. The crowd shifted aside, whispering still, but leaving a path. Margaret followed, her heart pounding with each step. A boy darted to her side, cruel mischief in his voice. "Hey, lady, did your father sell you 'Cause you ate too much?" Before she could react, Frederick stopped abruptly. He turned his gaze on the boy. The village fell silent. "Show some respect, Harlan," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying a weight that brooked no defiance. "Or perhaps your father would like to know who's been stealing his apples this week." The boy flushed scarlet, stammered, and vanished. Frederick resumed walking without another word. At the far edge of the village stood the smithy. Smoke curled from its chimney, the stone walls sturdy and weathered. Attached was a modest house. When they stepped inside, the heat of the forge wrapped around Margaret, the smell of metal and ash thick in the air. Frederick led her through to a small room off the kitchen. "This will be yours," he said simply. Inside was a narrow bed, a stool, and a wooden chest. The room was plain, but clean. Margaret nodded, words lodged in her throat. "I don't expect you to marry me," Frederick said suddenly, his eyes steady on hers. "What your father arranged was wrong. You may stay here until you decide what to do." Then, with no further explanation, he left her alone. The silence pressed in. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bare walls. All the pride of her family, all the grandeur of her upbringing had led to this moment. Cast off, discarded, delivered to a stranger. At last, the tears came. She wept quietly, shoulders shaking, until exhaustion claimed her. The days that followed opened her eyes to a life she had never known. At dawn, the ring of Frederick's hammer already echoed from the forge. The rhythm of work, the smell of smoke, the heat. It was unrelenting. The house was plain, but orderly, everything in its place. There were no servants here, no maids to smooth her gowns or prepare her meals. "Can you cook?" Frederick asked the first morning. Margaret hesitated. "No," she admitted softly. At the estate, every task had been carried out by others. She had never boiled water, never touched dough, never lit a fire. He nodded without judgment. "Then you'll learn. Here, everyone contributes." And so she tried. The first pot of porridge burned, the second drowned in salt. The bread she baked was hard enough to break teeth. Yet Frederick did not scold. He ate what she placed before him without complaint, offering quiet instruction afterward. He showed her how to measure, how to knead, how to keep the fire steady. The villagers, however, were not so patient. At the well, conversations fell silent when she approached. Laughter followed her steps. Children whispered and pointed. To them, she was not Margaret. She was the discarded daughter of the Grahams, an outsider who did not belong. One evening, as she sat across from Frederick, sorting nails into piles, she asked the question that had weighed on her. "Why do you defend me?" Her voice trembled despite her resolve. "You didn't have to take me in." Frederick set down a nail and looked at her across the lamplight. His face, always stern, seemed gentler in the flickering glow. "Because I know what it feels like not to belong," he said quietly. "When I came to Ironwood, I was an outsider too." Margaret studied him. His words were simple, yet behind them lay something unspoken, something he carried alone. She wanted to ask more, but his gaze drifted back to the nails, the moment gone. Still, his words lingered in her heart. For the first time in her life, Margaret Graham sensed that she might not be entirely alone. The first week in Ironwood was harder than Margaret could have imagined. At the Graham estate, she had never lifted more than a teacup. Now her days began at sunrise, the clang of Frederick's hammer shaking the walls before she even opened her eyes. The air smelled of ash and metal, the rhythm of work unrelenting. Her hands, once soft and pampered, quickly blistered from chores she had never done before. Fetching water from the well left her shoulders aching. Carrying firewood stained her dress with soot. Even scrubbing dishes felt like punishment. Yet she endured, though every night she collapsed onto the narrow bed, exhausted to the bone. Cooking remained her greatest trial. She ruined nearly everything she touched. One morning, she burned the porridge so badly that black smoke filled the kitchen. Another evening, she salted a pot of stew until it was nearly inedible. Yet Frederick never raised his voice. He would taste the dish quietly, set down his spoon, and then show her where she had gone wrong. His patience both puzzled and unsettled her. She had expected scorn. She had expected to be reminded of her failures, as she had been at home. Instead, she found herself learning slowly, awkwardly, but steadily. The villagers remained less forgiving. Whispers still followed her when she walked through the square. Children snickered behind their hands. At the well, women stopped their chatter the moment she appeared, their eyes flicking over her plain dress, her sturdy frame. Margaret forced herself to hold her head high, but the sting of their judgment never faded. One evening, as she mended a tear in one of Frederick's shirts, she finally asked what had weighed on her since her arrival. "Why did you take me in?" she whispered. "You didn't have to. My father forced you into this." Frederick, seated across from her, looked up from the iron nails he was sorting. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face. "I know what it feels like to be unwanted," he said quietly. "When I first came to Ironwood, I was an outsider too." "Where did you come from?" she asked. His gaze lingered on the lamp flame for a moment, then turned away. "Somewhere far from here, a place I left behind." There was finality in his tone, a wall she sensed she should not cross. But the mystery stirred her curiosity. Who was this man who showed her respect when no one else had? Days turned to weeks, and Margaret began to notice changes in herself. Her once soft hands grew calloused. The body that had been mocked as too heavy proved strong when hauling buckets or kneading bread. Tasks that once seemed impossible became manageable. She even began to take pride in small successes: the bread that rose properly, the stew that tasted right, the fire that burned steadily because she had tended it. One afternoon, while sweeping Frederick's workshop, Margaret's broom struck something under the workbench. She bent to look and found a heavy wooden chest, its surface scarred with age. A strange symbol, faint but familiar, was carved into the lock. She leaned closer. "Leave that." Frederick's voice cut sharply behind her. Startled, she straightened, nearly dropping the broom. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. "That chest belongs to the past," he said. His voice was controlled, but firm. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I wasn't trying to pry." For a moment he studied her, then his expression softened. "There are things best left unopened," he said quietly, before returning to his forge. That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the low ceiling. She had seen sorrow in his eyes, a burden carried silently. Who was he, truly? The answer would come sooner than she expected. One gray morning, a commotion arose outside. A child's cries pierced the air. Margaret opened the door to see a woman rushing toward the smithy, clutching her young son. His arm was blistered, angry red from a burn. "Please, help him!" the mother cried. Frederick froze, his face stricken. "I'll fetch the doctor," he said, reaching for his coat. "Wait," Margaret interrupted. A memory surfaced. Her grandmother's voice, her patient hands crushing herbs into paste. Margaret ran inside and pulled out the bundle Bertram Harris had given her on the day she left home. She opened the worn book, her fingers trembling. "I can help," she said firmly. Frederick hesitated, then stepped back. Margaret mixed a salve of calendula and linseed oil, spreading it gently over the child's burn. She wrapped it in clean cloth, murmuring soothing words as the boy whimpered. "Sing to him," she urged the mother. "It will calm him." The boy's sobs quieted as the woman sang softly. The angry red of the burn seemed less fierce under the cooling salve. When the child finally fell asleep in his mother's arms, Frederick stared at Margaret with open astonishment. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "My grandmother taught me," she said, still catching her breath. "She was a healer before she married into my family. She showed me herbs in secret, though my father forbade it." Frederick shook his head slowly. "To forbid such a gift is like smothering a fire. It only chokes the air." Word of Margaret's skill spread quickly. At first, women came in secret, bringing children with fevers, rashes, or coughs. Then the men came too, seeking remedies for cuts or injuries from the fields. Frederick even cleared a small corner of the smithy where she could dry herbs and prepare salves. He forged her knives for cutting plants, and a mortar and pestle for grinding them. "You're skilled with your hands," he said one afternoon, watching her stitch a wound with steady fingers. She glanced up at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "And you, with yours," she replied, nodding toward the iron gate he had crafted for the church, delicate as lacework. Something shifted between them in those weeks. The distance that had once existed gave way to a quiet familiarity. They worked side by side, she at her herbs, he at the forge. Their eyes would meet unexpectedly across the workshop, and in the firelight, Margaret sometimes felt warmth stir in her chest she could not name. In the evenings they sat together by the hearth. Frederick told her stories of the village, of its people and their histories. Margaret listened, slowly learning to see the villagers not as sneering faces, but as individuals with struggles of their own. And the villagers, in turn, began to see her not as the discarded daughter of the Grahams, but as the woman who could ease their pain. "You would have made a fine healer," Frederick told her one evening, his voice low. "Perhaps I already am," she said softly. He looked at her then, his eyes lingering longer than before, tracing her face in the firelight. Her heart thudded. For a moment, it felt as though the world held its breath. Then he cleared his throat and rose abruptly. "It's late," he said. "Tomorrow, the merchant comes from town. It will be a busy day." Margaret watched him go, her hand unconsciously pressing against her chest, where her heart still beat too quickly. She wondered what had just passed between them, and why it left her both unsettled and hopeful. The morning of market day arrived with a restless energy. Ironwood rarely bustled, but when traders came from nearby towns, the village square transformed into a place of noise and color. Margaret had begun to enjoy these rare outings. They gave her a chance to walk among others without always feeling the weight of their stares. More and more, the villagers greeted her with nods or quiet thanks for the remedies she had given them. She walked beside Frederick as they entered the square. Stalls lined the dusty street, filled with bolts of cloth, baskets of apples, smoked meats, and jars of honey. Children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, begging for sweets. The air smelled of bread baking in the open ovens. Margaret was just beginning to relax when a hush swept through the crowd. Heads turned. A polished carriage rolled into the square, drawn by 4 black horses. The villagers stepped aside with uneasy reverence. "Faulkner," Frederick muttered, his jaw tightening. The door of the carriage opened, and Baron Conrad Faulkner stepped down. Tall, elegant, his coat cut from the finest cloth, his boots gleaming. He looked like a man born to command. His eyes swept over the crowd with practiced ease, landing suddenly on Margaret. He stopped. Then, with deliberate steps, he strode toward her. "Is my sight deceiving me?" he said with a smooth smile. "Or do I see Margaret Graham standing here in this humble village?" Margaret froze. She knew him. She had seen him at gatherings in Richmond, had felt his sharp tongue laced with charm and menace. His reputation was one of ambition and cruelty. "Baron Faulkner," she said coolly, forcing steadiness into her voice. "What brings the daughter of William Graham to Ironwood?" he asked, his gaze flicking with mock amusement to her plain dress. "Your father told society you had entered a convent, yet here you are." "I live here," Margaret answered shortly. "At whose side, may I ask?" His smile widened. Frederick stepped forward, placing himself between them. "With me." Frederick Ellison, the blacksmith. The Baron's eyes narrowed, studying Frederick with the keen look of a hawk that has spotted prey. "Interesting," he murmured. "Your father always did have a talent for bending the truth." Margaret lifted her chin. "My father says many things." The Baron's smile did not falter, but his eyes gleamed with calculation. "We must speak further, my dear. You must visit me at Faulkner Manor. I insist." Without waiting for her reply, he turned back to his carriage. The villagers whispered as the horses trotted away, leaving the air heavy with unease. Frederick's hand closed around Margaret's arm, guiding her aside. His voice was low, urgent. "Be careful with him. He is dangerous. He has plans for this village, plans that will ruin everyone but himself." On the walk home, he told her what he had heard. The Baron wanted to seize land for a new ironworks, land that included Frederick's smithy. "He'll need an excuse to drive me out," Frederick said grimly. "And now that he knows who you are, he may use you to get it." That night, Margaret could not sleep. She tossed on her narrow bed, her mind filled with the Baron's calculating smile and Frederick's warning. She rose quietly, lit a small lamp, and paced the workshop. Her eyes fell again on the locked chest beneath the workbench. The carved symbol on the lock gleamed faintly in the lamplight. She knelt, brushing her fingers over it. The shape stirred memory, something she had seen in her father's library long ago. A crest, perhaps. "You shouldn't be here," she gasped, spinning around. Frederick stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the half-light. She began. He walked forward, his steps slow. His hand went to the chain around his neck, drawing out a small key. Without a word, he knelt beside the chest and unlocked it. "I never meant for you to see this," he said quietly. "But you deserve the truth." The lid creaked open. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in linen. Frederick unfolded it carefully. Out tumbled a seal ring engraved with a crest, a yellowed parchment bearing faded ink, and a dagger with a handle etched in silver. Margaret stared. The crest on the ring. Yes, she had seen it before, in her father's books. "My name is not Frederick Ellison," he said, his voice low, almost toneless. "I was born Frederick Eisenhart, third son of the Eisenhart family. Our lands bordered Faulkner's. When I was 19, mercenaries led by Conrad Faulkner raided our estate. They said it was bandits, but I knew better. My father and brothers were slaughtered. I survived only because I was away. When I returned, I saw what had been done. If I stayed, Faulkner would have hunted me down. So I disappeared. I took part of our name, hid in work I had learned in secret, blacksmithing, and became someone else." Margaret's breath caught. "You are of noble blood." He laughed bitterly. "What good is nobility when it cannot save your family? I have lived as a smith, and it is the only life that has given me peace." She reached out instinctively, laying her hand over his. His skin was rough, scarred by work, yet warm. "The Baron doesn't know who you are," she whispered. "He suspects, but he does not know. You still have a chance." Frederick closed his eyes, his jaw clenched. "If he discovers the truth, he will brand me a liar, a fraud, or worse, an enemy plotting rebellion." Margaret tightened her grip. "Then we must stand together. My father cast me aside because I did not fit his idea of perfection. Faulkner will not destroy you for refusing to bow." Their eyes met in the lamplight. For a moment, silence enveloped them. Frederick reached up, brushing a tear from her cheek with surprising tenderness. "What will we do?" she whispered. "We will fight," he said. "Not with swords, but with truth, and with each other." The words settled between them, heavy yet certain. In that quiet workshop, lit only by the flicker of the lamp, Margaret felt a bond forming stronger than any she had known. The night air was thick with the smell of smoke long before the alarm reached Ironwood. Margaret sat up in bed at the sound of frantic voices outside. Then the village bell clanged, sharp and urgent. "Fire!" someone shouted. "Buckland is burning!" Frederick burst into her room, already half-dressed, his face grim. "The neighboring village," he said quickly. "Come, we must help." Margaret pulled on her dress, grabbed the pouch of herbs and bandages she kept by her bed, and followed him outside. In the square, men gathered with buckets, axes, and shovels. Flames glowed against the horizon, painting the sky red. "The wind is driving it this way," warned the village elder. "If we don't stop it, Ironwood will be next." Frederick took command without hesitation. "Form a line to the stream. Pass buckets fast. The strongest men come with me. We'll cut fire breaks." Margaret stepped forward. "I will care for the injured." No one argued. Months ago, they would have laughed at her presumption. Now, no one doubted her. The scene in Buckland was chaos. Several houses were already engulfed, flames roaring into the night. Sparks leapt from roof to roof, devouring wood faster than men could douse it. Children screamed. Women cried out for missing loved ones. The air was thick with smoke. Margaret found a sheltered spot on the edge of the village and quickly set up a makeshift station. Injured began pouring in. Men with burns on their arms, women coughing violently from smoke, children scraped and bruised from falling timbers. She worked without pause. She spread cooling salves on blistered skin, mixed herbs to ease the lungs, wrapped wounds with strips of cloth. Her voice stayed steady, even as her heart raced. "Breathe here," she urged a coughing man, holding a cloth soaked with thyme and honey to his face. "Slowly, deeply. That's it." Between treatments, she glanced toward the flames. Frederick was there, dark against the fire, swinging his axe, shouting orders, his face blackened with soot. He moved with tireless energy, dragging beams, directing men, throwing water onto the flames. Once their eyes met across the smoke and noise. For a moment, the chaos fell away. He gave her the smallest nod, before turning back to the fire. Then a woman's scream pierced the night. "My child! My daughter's still inside!" Margaret whirled to see flames devouring a small house. Frederick did not hesitate. He charged toward the building, shoving aside those who tried to stop him. "Frederick, no!" Margaret cried, but he was already through the door. The seconds stretched into eternity. The roof crackled, threatening to collapse. Margaret pressed her fist to her mouth, her eyes burning from more than smoke. At last, Frederick staggered back into view, a small girl clutched in his arms. He thrust the child into her mother's embrace, then collapsed to his knees, racked with coughs. Men rushed to lift him, carrying him to Margaret's station. She fell to her knees beside him. His hands were burned raw, his breathing ragged. "Bring water," she ordered, her voice sharp with urgency. She pressed cool cloths to his skin, forced herbs between his lips. "You could have died," she whispered fiercely. He opened his eyes, weak but steady. The child would have. Through the long hours until dawn, Margaret worked by his side, tending the injured, forcing him to rest whenever she could. At last, as the first light touched the sky, the flames were beaten back. Buckland was devastated, but Ironwood stood. When the weary villagers returned home, a rider awaited them in the square. His horse bore the colors of Baron Faulkner. "Frederick Ellison?" he called. Frederick, leaning on Margaret's arm, stepped forward. "Here." The rider raised his voice so all could hear. "The Baron commends your courage and leadership in fighting the fire. As reward, he grants you 1 year free of rent." The villagers cheered, though Margaret felt Frederick's body tense. "And," the rider added, turning toward her, "the Baron reminds Miss Graham that he still awaits her visit." The cheer died into silence. Margaret felt every eye upon her. She lowered her gaze, heat rising to her cheeks. Back at the smithy, Frederick sank onto his bed, his body shaking with exhaustion. Margaret tended his burns carefully, her hands trembling. "That fire was no accident," he rasped. "It began in 3 places at once. Someone said it." "You mean Faulkner?" Margaret said softly. Frederick nodded. "He will not stop until he has what he wants." 3 days later, another letter arrived, this time bearing the Graham seal. Margaret broke it open with trembling hands. The words blurred as she read. Her father was gravely ill. He was asking for her. "It could be a trap," Frederick warned. "If Faulkner controls the estate, he may be using this to draw you away." Margaret shook her head. "The letter is from Bertram Harris. He would not lie. My father may truly be dying, and at Graham Estate there may be records, proof of Faulkner's crimes. Frederick tried to rise, but pain forced him back. Then let me come with you. You can't, Margaret said firmly. You're too weak, and someone must guard the smithy. Faulkner would seize the chance if we both left. He pressed something into her hand, a small dagger with a hilt he had crafted long ago. It was the first piece I forged as a master, he said quietly. Take it with you. She hesitated, then leaned down and embraced him. I will return, she whispered. I promise. 2 days later, Margaret rode toward Graham Estate, the towers of her childhood home rising in the distance. Her heart was heavy with dread and resolve. She was no longer the frightened girl who had left in shame. She was returning with purpose. The towers of Graham Estate loomed against the gray sky as Margaret approached, her stomach twisting with memories. The carriage halted at the gate. 2 guards eyed her suspiciously until she spoke her name. They exchanged startled looks before rushing inside. Moments later, Bertram Harris, stooped with age yet steady as ever, appeared. Miss Margaret, he breathed, relief flooding his features. Thank God you came. He led her quickly through the familiar halls. The scent of polished wood and candle wax stirred memories of childhood laughter, of her mother's gentle hand. But those days felt like another life. Now, silence pressed heavy over the house. At the door to her father's chamber, Bertram paused. He is very weak. Not the man you remember. The illness has worn him down. Margaret entered softly. William Graham lay in a great bed, his once powerful frame wasted to shadows. His face was pale, his lips cracked. His eyes fluttered open as she knelt beside him. Father, she whispered. Margaret? His voice was scarcely more than breath. You came. Yes, Father. I am here. She took his cold hand gently. Tears welled in his eyes. Forgive me, he rasped. I was blind. I saw only what you were not, never what you are. Her own eyes burned. Rest, Father. I forgive you. In the hours that followed, Margaret tended him with the knowledge her grandmother had given her, easing his fever with herbs, cooling his lips with honey water. At night, while he slept, she searched the library and archives with Bertram's help. It was Bertram who finally brought her a dust-covered book, the old chronicles of the county. Here, he said, opening to a faded entry. It records the oath sworn by Faulkner's father to the Eisenhart family, an oath later broken by Conrad Faulkner when he attacked their estate. Margaret's pulse quickened. This is proof that Frederick was wronged, that Faulkner is guilty of treachery. But before she could copy the pages, she returned to her father's chamber and froze. Baron Conrad Faulkner sat at his bedside. "Ah, Margaret," he said smoothly, rising. "How fortunate to see you again. Your father and I were just discussing your future." Her father's eyes were closed, his breath shallow. "What future?" she demanded. The Baron's smile was cold. "A marriage contract, signed this very night, with me. Your father agreed that as his only heir, you will inherit Graham Estate. As my wife, it will pass into my hands." Margaret's stomach dropped. He is too ill to make such decisions. He has already signed. Faulkner held out a parchment, her father's weak, wavering signature at the bottom. Margaret's heart pounded. "And if I refuse? Then you remain cast off, nameless, with no protection. And as for your blacksmith," his lips curled, "Ironwood stands on land I intend to seize. He will be swept aside with the rest." A low groan came from the bed. William Graham's eyes opened, cloudy with pain. "Margaret," he whispered, "listen. He has poisoned me." Faulkner stiffened, his mask slipping for the first time. Margaret gasped. "What?" "Each night," her father whispered, "the wine from him." His breath rattled. "He raves," Faulkner snapped, his voice sharp. "Fever dreams. He doesn't know what he says." His hand fell to the hilt of his sword. Margaret's fingers flew to the dagger Frederick had given her. She pulled it free, steel flashing in the candlelight. "Guards!" she shouted. The doors burst open. But it was not the Baron's men who entered. It was Frederick, Bertram, and several allies bearing arms. "Frederick!" Margaret cried in shock. "How, I couldn't wait," he said grimly, eyes locked on Faulkner. "Not once I learned you were here with him." The Baron's laugh was bitter. "So, Frederick Ellison, or should I say, Frederick Eisenhart, a fallen noble hiding behind a forge. You stole my family's lands," Frederick said, his voice icy. "You murdered them under cover of lies. Tonight, the truth comes to light." "Prove it," Faulkner spat. Margaret stepped forward, holding the chronicles high. "We can. Here is the oath your father swore, the oath you broke with blood. And here," she gestured to Bertram, "is testimony from one who survived your attack." The Baron's face twisted with fury. With a snarl, he lunged at Frederick, sword flashing. Frederick snatched a fire iron from the hearth, parrying the blow. Steel clanged against iron, sparks flying. They fought fiercely. Frederick weakened from his burns, but driven by rage. Margaret shielded her father, heart hammering. "You should have stayed in your forge," Faulkner growled, pressing him back. "And you should have honored your oath," Frederick retorted, shoving hard. The Baron stumbled against a stool. Frederick struck, wrenching the sword from his hand and driving him to the floor. Guards rushed in, startled by the sight. "Seize him," William Graham croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Conrad Faulkner is guilty of treason and murder." The guards hesitated only a moment before obeying. The Baron struggled, cursing as they dragged him away. Frederick collapsed to his knees, chest heaving. Margaret rushed to him, pressing cloth to the cut on his arm. "You shouldn't have come," she scolded, tears spilling. "I couldn't let him harm you," he said hoarsely. Her father watched them, his eyes softening. "You love him," he murmured. Margaret froze, then nodded. "Yes, I do." A faint smile touched the old man's lips. "Then marry him. He is worthy." Days later, Faulkner was brought before the regional council. The evidence was undeniable. The chronicles, the testimony, even the confession of one of his own men. Stripped of title and land, he was sentenced to life in prison. The lands of the Eisenhart family were restored to Frederick. He stood beside Margaret as the verdict was declared. But afterward, he turned to her with a strange expression. "My title is restored," he said quietly. "But I am not sure I want it. The forge, the work of my hands, that is who I have become." Margaret clasped his hand. "Then we will choose together. We need no title to know our worth." Her father, recovering slowly under her care, gave them his blessing. "You have taught me more than I ever taught you," he said softly. That spring, Margaret and Frederick were wed in Ironwood. The villagers gathered in the meadow, surprised still that the discarded Graham daughter and the quiet blacksmith had become something greater together. Some nobles attended as well, curious about the union of a lady and a smith. But Margaret cared little for whispers. She stood beneath the open sky, hand in Frederick's, and spoke her vows with steady heart. They built a new house beside the smithy, one room dedicated to Margaret's healing work. The forge rang with Frederick's hammer, while shelves filled with herbs and tinctures lined the walls where Margaret tended the sick. Together, they became more than titles, more than roles. They became partners. A year later, as the sun set over Ironwood, Frederick stepped from the forge, sweat on his brow, and saw Margaret outside, teaching a young girl how to prepare a salve. Laughter drifted from them, soft and real. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The life you might have had?" Margaret leaned into him, her smile gentle. "Not for a moment. My father cast me aside, believing I had no worth. But he sent me exactly where I needed to be." Frederick kissed her brow, the echo of the forge behind them. "Sometimes we must lose everything to discover what matters most." Margaret looked toward the smithy, its fire burning bright against the darkening sky. "And sometimes," she said with a smile, "a lady must be given to a blacksmith for them both to find their true value." The forge crackled, warm and steady. Their life, forged in hardship and fire, glowed brighter than any title could bestow.